Well, hello, my friends, and welcome back to another episode, I suppose you could call it, of Carpo's Corner. Man, it's not really Carpo's Corner. It's also not 15-minute free thinking. This is just going to be a standard video for YouTube. Try to label these things in series, and it doesn't really serve any purpose. If this particular video were to fit anything, it would be my drugs folder, which has become a bit diminished and let's just say kind of dissolved over time. And what do I mean by that? Well, let me just start off by DMT is what I'm going to talk about. I need to make that very clear if it's not already clear in the title, which when I start a video, I don't know how I'm going to title it. But this video is about dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. I made a video yesterday for Carpo's Corner called Drugs, and it was about drugs in general, and I believe that I honestly don't feel like I covered even 5% of what I wanted to talk about because it was off the cuff, as it usually is. And this, as well, is off the cuff. But I need to stick to one substance. There are several different drugs out there that people use. You know, legal drugs, prescriptions, pharmaceuticals. You've got, opiates. You've got benzos. You've got cannabis, cannabis derivatives and synthetic cannabis derivatives, and you've got um, the psychedelic community, if you will. And in that psychedelic group are, when I talk about DMT, I'm not going to get technical here. People are like, well, DMT, dimethyltryptamine. What does that mean? Well, it's di, meaning two, methyl, it's two methyl groups. It's a tryptamine with two methyl groups. What does that do for the average consumer or a person who wants to know, how to use them or properly benefit from them? Naturally, the neighbor dogs have to come out and bark. They do this every time I make a video, so I'm just used to it. And so when I was introduced to DMT, I was about 18, 19 years old, and a friend of ours came back to the house we were living in. It was kind of a party house, and he said, I got some DMT. We'd all taken psychedelics for several years, but none of us had tried that. I'll just say that was a crazy, weird evening. I don't even really remember what happened, except we came to and we were kind of looking out the window, like thinking the cops were there or something. I was paranoid. I didn't even know what to expect. It wasn't what you would expect from a DMT trip. It's not like we were worried. It was just we were caught off guard. And fast forward about 15 years, and I was at Soak, which is the regional Burning Man, and this was in, I think, 2008 or 9. My band was playing there. My brother and I and our bandmate Sam, maybe it was Duncan at the time, but we went down there and we played the show, had a great time, stayed for the weekend, met this guy at our campsite who had some DMT, smoked a little bit. I think maybe I just bought it, but at any rate, I took it home, and this was derived from, well, there's several different types of DMT, but if you get the stuff that's red, it's usually extracted from Mimosa hostilis root bark, and that root bark contains like 5% DMT, up to. And people order it in bulk, and then they refine it down using naphtha and various acids and bases, and it's not a hard process. So the guy had a bunch of it, and bless his soul, the guy died in a house fire about 10 years ago. It was a grow room that caught on fire, and somehow he couldn't make it out. I don't know the whole story, but let's just say for a couple of years I was buying DMT from the guy, and he was pretty well known in the community here in Portland, and it was really good stuff. And I'll never forget sitting on my back porch right here, literally 5 feet from where I'm at right now, my chair turned facing out, and I went all the way in. And when I say all the way in, I mean the average DMT consumer only has a couple options: either intravenous, which no one does, or you smoke it. If you ingest it orally, it's not active because your monoamine oxidase, you probably heard that term, there is a certain drugs you can take that are called monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And I had to switch to my second camera here because I started out with my first one thinking that it would work, but my other camera ended up dying halfway through the podcast, which is why I had this one running as well. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors stop that monoamine from oxidizing the chemical. So you eat DMT and your body breaks it down. Well, if you take an MAOI, it doesn't break that chemical down. It's very important to realize that these inhibitors that break things down are important for your body to fight certain compounds your body doesn't want. But certain medicines require that you bypass that. So if you take DMT orally with an MAOI, that's basically what they call pharmawaska. And it's the same as what you would call ayahuasca, but it's not the same because ayahuasca is usually like Banisteropsis caapi vine for an MAOI, I believe, or perhaps that's the DMT. At any rate, it's been a while. And I watched a video, or listened to a podcast rather, the other day. It was a Joe Rogan podcast, and he had on one of my favorite people, Rick Strassman. He wrote a book called DMT, the Spirit Molecule. He's a doctor who did a lot of research, and he's had a lot of personal psychedelic experience as well as in the lab experience, and he's kind of trying to figure out what DMT is all about. So I could ramble all day about what DMT may or may not be, but I want to make one thing clear for anyone out there still listening who doesn't know anything about DMT. It's endogenous. Endogenous means that your body produces it naturally. It means that your brain somewhere produces endogenous DMT. Now, there have been studies done that have shown that it is most prominent when you're born, when you are having a baby, or when you die. Now, DMT levels can be very high when you're close to death. We're not sure exactly why, but it's very hard to test because DMT degrades so fast in the bloodstream that if your brain's producing it, it's likely not testable unless you can get into the brain while you're alive, which requires getting into where they think it is, which is naturally a gland that is at the very, very base of the skull and very difficult to access. The same one that produces melatonin, what some people call the third eye. And the brain has many different glands. It's the only one that's not symmetrical. And it does produce melatonin. And so to get back to the drug itself, because I don't want to get too far into the science of it, because I'm not an expert in this, and nobody really is. Even the experts are just stumped, not as to what DMT is, but why it is so prevalent in the brain, and why it is so active at certain times, but why a natural experience can mimic a, let's just say, induced experience with. There are different forms of DMT, I want to make this clear. You know, smoking DMT that is extracted is not the same as licking a toad, right? This is, I believe it's a 5-MeO DMT. It's completely different than NN-DMT, which they're different compounds and they have different effects, but they're very similar. The only real similarity is that they both are very intense and relatively short acting. And I have not done the toad venom thing, but let's just say that for a couple of years I had a very, very wide and vast experience with dimethyltryptamine. And as I said, 5 feet from here, I sat there and I took some in, a lot. I inhaled a lot, and I do not recommend this. I'm just saying this is my experience. Sat back until I couldn't smoke anymore. And then I just watched the entire world melt into a tunnel and went to this place. As I came back, the sidewalk, the deck that used to be over here, there were like swirls of tie-dye just moving up and down, every plank back and forth, and there was just all these colors, and the plants were talking to me, and it was this overwhelming sense of peace and contentment and understanding. and I don't know what to make of it. I've had several experiences before that and since then, but that particular one set me on a path of wondering, what exactly is this reality? What kind of a construct does DMT play a role in who we are and how we perceive the world? Is DMT really more important than we think, or is it less important than we think in the big picture? Even with cannabis, the body produces, cannabis-like compounds. In fact, the way that our natural bliss molecule, if you will, was discovered was through research on cannabis. And there are natural cannabinoid receptors in the brain, right? And they call this chemical that's produced by the body that is similar to THC, at least the one that THC mimics, and THC is the active component in cannabis, one of them. It's called anandamide. They called it anandamide, and Ananda was like the bliss god of ancient times. So they literally named it after bliss. It's the bliss molecule, weed, right? THC, the one that they've kept illegal for so long. But with several other compounds as well, I don't know, not to get too much into the technical side nor the legal side of it, but these many compounds are produced by the brain. If you've ever heard the term endorphin, you should know that the term endorphin means endogenous morphine. Endorphin, endogenous morphine. That's literally what it stands for. And endorphins are your natural morphine that your body produces. When you take an opiate or opioid, it acts and mimics that same effect, which is why you have pain relief. Just the way when you take the bliss molecule, like cannabis, you smoke THC, it's very similar to anandamide. Well, DMT, on the other hand, is very similar to DMT. In other words, your body produces the exact same compound. It's not just found in you, it's found in all different types of animals. And not just that, but plants. Most plants contain DMT to some degree. You can even extract it from phalaris, like a reed canary grass that grows all over here as an invasive species. It has a pretty high percentage, like 1 or 2%, I think. And when you think about a huge pile of grass, 1 or 2% can be a lot of DMT. But anyhow, it's a fascinating compound and one that I highly revere. I think the last time I did it was several years ago, probably 3 or 4 years ago, at a campfire when everybody was asleep, and I was kind of doing my own thing, and I remembered I had it. It's the kind of thing that once you've been there to that place, you don't really need to go back. You don't really need to understand. Because on a final note here, I don't think that DMT is a very good drug for most people, especially those who are seeking to overcome various problems or illnesses. It can be so intense. I'm talking mental illness. It can become so intense and so quick. Not only can you not process anything, but it almost makes you even more confused. But I do think that psilocybin and LSD and other more long-acting compounds can benefit people. I just think that people should be really wary about DMT and think of it as kind of like the whipped cream on the ice cream. It's just a little addition of some extra sweetness. You don't need it though. It's just good to have it once in a while. I don't know. It's unique, and I don't know what to make of it. And I would urge extreme caution for anyone who's considering trying it. So hopefully I covered everything. I definitely don't want to. I would recommend, if anyone wants to try it or has tried it, either or, read The Spirit Molecule by Rick Strassman. It's a great book. It's pretty long, but it's very detailed as to what you might expect from a journey. However, it doesn't really teach you how to handle it. In that sense, that's something that's up to you. And I would almost say maybe you don't want to read it, only for one reason. at least until after you've tried it. Because a lot of folks don't realize people who smoke DMT talk about seeing the gnomes or the fairies, the creatures, the beings, the laughing jesters. It could be anything. It could be animals, it could be insects that are in these kaleidoscopic visions that seem to be chanting with you. There's some sort of a Zen kind of ridiculousness to it. And for those people, a lot of them, I wonder if they're influenced by what they expected from DMT. Somebody's like, oh yeah, you're going to see the gnomes. Next thing you know, they're seeing gnomes, right? Or whatever it might be. It's important, I think, that people start with a neutral mind, a blank slate, and have a sitter. Somebody who can watch over you, make sure you're okay. It only lasts a few minutes. It's very intense, and it's not the kind of thing that I would ever abuse, or really, I'm not that interested in doing anymore. And maybe that's why I'm talking about it, because I've had such a vast experience with psychedelics, but I don't talk about them much because of the stigma. And I find myself getting caught up in that stigma, saying, you know, if I'm talking to hundreds of people on YouTube, I don't want to be promoting things that might be harmful to someone, because I have personally seen people fall out of grace using too many psychedelics, falling into this kind of a psychosis, delusions of grandeur. People start seeing patterns. Apophenia and pareidolia take over. These are things you should definitely look into before you do these things. But for the average person who, you know, a person has to weigh their own options, the benefits versus risks. And I think that DMT is something that should be reserved for the experienced psychonaut. It's not for everyone. I really recommend people start with something more mild. If they're considering looking within, maybe they should try something like mushrooms. But ultimately, I'm not a doctor. I'm not here to recommend anything. Do not try anything I said in this video. Do not, you know, take any of my suggestions. To protect myself and yourself, I have to say, I'm just some guy spouting nonsense. And that's my ramble for today. And thanks for listening. DMT. Weird stuff. Really weird stuff. Peace.